flow is our natural state of being. It's less about adding things and more about removing the things that are blocking you from flow. And I love that analogy of the river, and there's a bunch of boulders blocking the water from flowing. And if we can just remove those boulders, we can flow. And what I mean by boulders is anything that's zapping your relationship or that's out of alignment. Example, when I was a kid, the reason I was struggling to learn is because I was in a classroom with girls I wanted to talk to and boys I wanted to play with and a teacher that was boring. And so that wasn't in alignment with my style of learning. I then started to really focus on bringing things into alignment. That's why I came up with the new word Flowjo, right? The word mojo, which is an Afro-Caribbean word, which means unique magical power. And I mashed it together with flow. It's like, how do we harness our uniqueness, our strengths, our passions, our purpose, our values, and make sure that everything in our life aligns to that?
Welcome to Successful with ADHD. I'm Brooke Schnittman. Let's get started. Welcome back to another great episode of Successful with ADHD. Today, I have a special guest for you, Jamie Toyne. He's a serial entrepreneur, an author, founder of Flowjo. He is an ADHD coach as well, recent graduate of 3C Activation for Coaches. So thrilled that you're here. Today, we're going to dig into his ADHD journey, what he does in burning out to flow with ADHD. We know that so many of us burn out pretty much regularly, like multiple times a day sometimes, multiple times a week, multiple times a month. So Jamie is going to lead us through that. And just a little bit about Jamie. He was diagnosed with ADHD as a child, and he's burned out 3 times in his career, once as a professional tennis player, and twice as a business owner. And after researching the connection between ADHD, burnout, and flow, Jamie developed a coaching program called Flowjo, which helps ADHD founders to cure burnout, harness their ADHD superpowers, and start flowing towards their goals. Jamie's the author of The Pressure Gauge Mindset and the founder of 2 other companies called Deal Flow and Exit Planner that helped more than 400 entrepreneurs successfully exit their business. Welcome, Jamie. I don't even know that I knew that you were a professional tennis player.
That was a really long time ago, and I'm a bit icky about it. And if I share some of my story, maybe that will make a little bit more sense. But I played on the professional circuit for a year when I was quite young, and it ended very dramatically. So yeah, I don't talk about it. It's not a part of my bio that I talk about very much.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a tennis player. I actually just came from a tennis match myself, lost for the 3rd time in a row.
Oh.
Not fun, but I do love tennis. It is my sport of choice. So I am glad to hear that. So I just learned something new about you. Anyway, tell me, Jamie, when did you learn you had ADHD?
I was 11, and I was getting into a lot of trouble at school. I was spending a lot of time on home suspension, actually, for behavioral issues. And so, the school recommended that to my mum that I go and get checked for ADHD. And I did. And I was diagnosed. But mum didn't like the idea of medicating her 11-year-old child with meth at that age. So I continued unmedicated, and I continued to struggle through school. But luckily for me, there were certain things that I could hyper focus on and get into a flow state. And one of those was tennis, which was kind of a savior for me. And it allowed me to, it opened up a lot of doors. I got to travel. I got to, it was a positive experience for me. I had a good relationship with my coach because I wanted to be there on the tennis court. It was great for my self-esteem because I realized I wasn't just this terrible kid that had no respect or any discipline or anything like that.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? So I know you personally. So obviously I have seen firsthand the difference between when you're interested in something and when you're not. And the fact that you were able to literally just drive purpose out of the passion of tennis for however long it was when you were suspended from school, but your self-esteem was lifted because you had purpose, you had passion, you were really good at it. That's it's so wonderful. So what happened with school after when you were playing tennis? Were you homeschooled?
Yeah, so I continued to struggle through school till I was about 16. And then I got permission from the state. Well, at first I moved interstate to a sporting school, which actually I grew up in Australia, but the schooling system mimicked the American college system. So we had to get a certain GPA as a sports player to be able to play the sport. And my GPA was terrible because I was playing up in the classroom. So I was going to this great tennis school. I got a scholarship there, but I couldn't play the tennis because of my behavior in the classroom. But I was playing at a relatively high level at that point. So the state education department gave me permission to drop out of school and basically train full time and join the men's pro tennis circuit. So at that point, I finished my last 2 years of schooling by distance education, essentially. So I took my books on the road with me and I had a tutor online, and I was like a digital nomad before that was a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I used to work at a school that worked with a lot of professional tennis players that were on the circuit. That's a lot of work for you trying to travel and then fit in education as well when you're not playing tennis, traveling, training, all the things.
Totally. Yeah. It was a big shift, right? Because I went from this like punishment and reward system of school that I really struggled with to having to create that for myself, essentially.
Yeah.
I had to manage my diet, my conditioning, what time I went to bed, what time I got up, when I did my schoolwork between matches. It was really hard. And, I think that's probably hard for any adult. I still struggle with that sort of stuff as an adult now. But with for an unmedicated teenager with ADHD, it was a really big challenge. But the really interesting thing about that experience was I did actually sort of learn better because I was working one-on-one with a tutor and I was working in my own time when I sort of felt like it. I didn't have the distractions of the classroom. I wasn't focused on making kids laugh in the classroom and things like that. I just was there with my books. So I found a way to finish school that worked for me. And that was a really pivotal sort of moment in my life. And I think with managing or harnessing rather, my ADHD was really designing a life that works for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Without even realizing it at the time. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So fast forward. So you had the one-on-one education, you weren't being medicated. You were thriving, you were doing better in a one-on-one environment with a tutor, teacher. Then what happened after high school?
I got this. So I started getting these sponsorships, and most of the sponsorships were exciting. They were free equipment and free clothing. But one of the sponsorships that I got was more like an investor. And the deal was, it was a pretty rare situation. I didn't know any other kids on the circuit with this deal. But basically this wealthy man who was obsessed with tennis said he'll pay for everything, travel, training, everything. And in exchange, he would take a 10% cut of my prize money. Now, he knew he wasn't going to get $1 back on his investment unless I really cracked the top 50 or top 20 or something like that. And I was so far away from that as a 16, 17-year-old boy. And it put an immense amount of pressure on me. The tennis court it went from being this sort of sanctuary where I could drop into a flow state and get out of the sort of scattered chaos of my mind and into my body. And I remember basically as soon as I got that sponsorship, it changed. The pressure just totally changed. And I was in my head all the time on the tennis court in training. I started throwing tantrums on the tennis court. I even started to deliberately lose matches because I was just so overwhelmed by it all. And so on my 18th birthday, actually, in very dramatic form, I smashed all my rackets, I forfeited the match, and I quit the sport forever.
You sound like John McEnroe.
Yeah. So anyway, I went to business school. I got a job at a tech company and got the opportunity to move to San Francisco and started sort of buying and selling small businesses and started my own consulting business a few years later, headquartered in San Francisco there. And then I moved to Mexico. The business was doing quite well at that point. And so, I was sort of living my dream. I grew up in a small desert town in the middle of Australia. So living on the beach, running a successful company, surfing and learning Spanish. Things were going really well. And then I burnt out again, and I packed my bags and I flew back to that small desert town that I hadn't lived in 12 years or something like that. And I moved back in with my mum. And that was when I started to really start sort of questioning the relationship between ADHD and burnout, and why I was burning out.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really interested in hearing the next steps of, questioning the ADHD and burnout, but it sounds like every step you've taken along the way has proven that you really are a free spirit, right? You don't want to be held down, and you want to follow by your own rules, your own passions, not by someone else's.
Yeah, that's spot on. I think I'm very lucky to have had a mother who really understood fundamentally that if she tried to control me through discipline, that it would not work for me. And she was incredibly supportive. A lot of parents would have felt really uncomfortable about letting their kid drop out of school, especially one that was struggling to study at all. So yeah, I think she sort of gave me that permission when I was younger, and I've just sort of followed that throughout my life.
Yeah. So you said that you eventually, when you had moved back in with your mom, you had noticed that there might be some connection between ADHD and burnout.
Yeah. And I think for me, I because I had sort of such a close relationship with sort of flow states, that sort of altered state of consciousness when we're performing at our best. I'd experienced that on the tennis court. I'd experienced that on the dance floor. I'd experienced that in, really beautiful, deep conversation, and at times running my business as well. And so I knew that there was this sort of potential. You talk a lot about unlocking your potential. There were moments when I would be in my potential. But a lot of the time I felt really blocked from that. And I became obsessed with flow, basically. And so I became, during that time, I took 6 months off. So I stepped down as the CEO of my business, and I took 6 months off to basically garden and do therapy and hang out with my mom. And in that time, I just geeked out on flow. And I became convinced that the antidote to burnout was flow. And so off I went to unlock flow. And what's really interesting about flow, and what I learned in those 2 years before I burnt out a third time, was that the way that we approach flow in the West is almost synonymous with peak performance now. So we look at flow through a really narrow lens. This is the ice baths, the saunas, the breath work, all of this sort of biohacking, trying to hack your biology, your mind, your body to perform at your best. And I got really good at those things. But a couple of years I burnt out again, and I was doing really well. That's when I published my book and launched my first software company, and I burnt out again. And so it was after that third burnout that I looked a little bit deeper into, I guess, the meaning of flow historically, because it's been around for ages. Like the ancient Greeks called it enthusiasmos, and Zen Buddhists called it zazen. The Taoist monks called it wu wei. So it's been around for a really long time. And what I realized was that I was approaching flow in a really narrow way.
Almost in a reactive way rather than a proactive way.
Yeah, correct. And I think I was trying to add all of these things to my life to sort of, reduce anxiety, increase focus. What I realized by reading these sort of Eastern texts is that flow is our natural state of being. We experience flow all the time as kids. And so it's less about adding things and more about removing the things that are blocking you from flow. And I love that analogy of the river, and there's a bunch of boulders blocking the water from flowing. And if we can just remove those boulders, we can flow. And what I mean by boulders is, could be anything. It could be anything that's zapping your relationship or that's out of alignment. So an example, when I was a kid, the reason I was struggling to learn is because I was in a classroom with girls I wanted to talk to and boys I wanted to play with, and a teacher that was boring. And so that wasn't in alignment with my style of learning. And there's myriad examples throughout my life, but I then started to really focus on bringing things into alignment. And I think that's why I came up with the new word Flowjo. right? It's like, the word mojo, which is an Afro-Caribbean word, which means unique magical power. And I mashed it together with flow because it's like, how do we harness our uniqueness, our strengths, our passions, our purpose, our values, and make sure that everything in our life aligns to that?
Yeah.
So that sort of became my focus. Yeah.
So you talk about the aligning piece, right? To make sure that you get all of the pieces together to be in flow. But give me another example of some restrictions of flow. So yeah, there's that external piece, like you're in a classroom, the teacher's boring, you want to flirt with the girls and talk to the boys. But like day-to-day workflow or day flow, like you seem to love what you're doing right now. So what types of barriers would come your way that would block you from the flow?
I love that question. So, I mean, it still comes back to those same things around alignment, but let's say I'm procrastinating, or like there's a project on my to-do list that I've been delaying or putting off for weeks and weeks and weeks. One option is to sort of just try and push through that. I talk about the carrot and the stick, right? The discipline stick and dangling the carrot, the carrot of motivation. So that's sort of how I used to approach things, and I would try and push through. But it's kind of what led to burnout, I believe, if you keep using that approach. So I try to ask myself, like, what is the resistance? Like, why am I not? There's a good reason I don't want to do this, and sometimes it can be as simple as the project's poorly defined or the timeline's realistic, and so using things like we cover in your amazing program, using SMART goals, making the task, defining the task better could be a really simple intervention, but it could also be a really big thing where it's like, I actually don't like the idea of being on Instagram, and maybe one of the things is like, I've told myself, I've got to build a personal brand on Instagram and I've got to start creating reels. I could outsource that to someone else. But why do I keep resisting this? And so you go back to your values, and maybe there's a misalignment there where there's something about being on Instagram that just feels a bit icky, and really giving yourself permission to listen to that and honor that. So it's almost like the mind creates all these stories about what you should do, and just checking in with the body and going, because your body's got its own brain, I believe. And so, checking in with the body and how does that feel? And then trying to investigate why. I talk about these two parts of myself. I have like my higher self, which is the general that comes up with the plan of what to do. And then I talk about my lower self, which I call my workhorse, right? And I sort of picture the general sitting on the back of my workhorse with the carrot and the stick. And that relationship has always been very damaged. Mm-hmm. My higher self, my general is sort of setting these unrealistic expectations, or it's the mind saying, I should. But it's the workhorse that has to get up and actually do the work. And so I really focus on making sure that those two parts of myself are working together as a team. And for, I would say most of my life, they haven't been. And it's taken a lot of conscious effort to get those two parts of myself to work together.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So what are your thoughts? Stephen Kotler talks about the different ways that you can get yourself into flow with hard charger, having quiet spaces. What are your thoughts about that? So like, I know from a higher self, when you have your purpose, your vision, your passion, all those things, and you remove the traction and you ask yourself why you have resistance, and maybe you move away from that, right? Then you can be in flow. But tell me, like, do you believe that people have different flow styles?
Yeah, the way that we access flow is completely unique to us. It comes back to, like figuring out what works for you. But Stephen Kotler, and he works for the Flow, he's the co-founder of the Flow Research Collective. That whole body of work is really looking at flow from a biological perspective, and it's scientifically proven to work. So there are what they would call flow triggers that trigger flow. So there's types of music that can drop you into a flow state. His co-founder, Rian Doris, talks about our brainwave frequency. And if we can start work within 60 seconds of waking time, when our brain is still in that in that space,
Theta.
I think between
Theta and delta. Gamma, yeah.
Theta and delta, yeah. We can drop right. There's a lot less friction, a lot less resistance. We can drop right into a flow state. So there are a bunch of flow hacks essentially that can get you there. What I've found is the efficacy of those flow hacks really depend on how things are going in your life more holistically. I mean, if you're going through a breakup or you're having your relationship with your business partner is deteriorating or your investors are about to pull out, it doesn't matter how many ice baths you do or how much breath work you do, it's going to be really hard to get into flow.
Yeah.
So I do usually, I'm looking for the big boulders first. It's almost like focus on removing first and then focus on what you can add. Because once the river's clear from boulders, you add those flow triggers in there, it acts like rocket fuel. Whereas the other way around, if you focus on that first, which is what I did between my second and third burnout, it's almost like you're delaying or postponing the burnout, or you're minimizing the symptoms. We do this all the time in the West, Brooke. I feel like we focus on the symptom rather than the underlying cause.
Of course, yeah. The hack or how to treat the thing rather than what is getting us to feel that way, right? Like,
correct.
We're really only supposed to have one doctor, but we have 20 doctors because we're treating all the different symptoms, like Casey Mean talks about. So I appreciate that. So you mentioned that you've been in burnout 3 times. How do you, with being in flow state, because you can get to extreme exhaustion when all of the neurochemicals and transmitters are being used, right? It's like this high. So how do you slow yourself down and avoid burnout when you're constantly in flow?
Active recovery.
Talk to me about that.
There's 2 different types of recovery, I suppose, or 2 different states of not working, I suppose. And that's active recovery and passive recovery. And so an example of passive recovery would be you finish the day of work, you might have been in a flow state, you might not have been, and you crack open a beer and you jump on the couch and you watch some TV. And so, as we know, TV's highly stimulating, and it's using all those same, your dopamine system and all those same neurochemicals. So you're not giving yourself a chance to replenish those neurotransmitters at all. Another example would be doom scrolling on social media or YouTube or what have you. An example of active recovery, switching off your phone and going for a walk, or listening to a podcast, or cooking, or pottering around in the garden, or going to the sauna, or, the gym, depending on what you're doing. If you're overexerting yourself, probably not. But, doing things that sleep is the obvious one, or as Andrew Huberman preaches, a non-sleep deep rest protocol. That's kind of the simplest way I could just explain how you don't burn out on a regular basis, just from getting into a flow state. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, or maybe it was Stephen Kotler. I'm one of the 2. Stephen Kotler definitely talks about it. I'm not sure if Mihai came up with it, but talks about the 4 stages of the flow cycle. There's 2 stages, basically. You're on or you're off, and you're either struggling. So stage 1 is struggle, where you're sort of, if it's on the tennis court, you're training hard. You might not be in a flow state, but if the challenge is way exceeds your skill level, then you're going to experience stress and overwhelm. And if your skill way exceeds the challenge, you're going to experience boredom and apathy. And if you can get the right balance between those 2 things, that's called the flow channel, and you're more likely to experience flow. So in the struggle phase, you might really jack up the challenge to skill ratio. So the challenge is you're training really hard, and you're deliberately putting stress on the body, and you're not going to be able to access a flow state. But then the next phase of the flow cycle is release. And so that's very similar to the active recovery. You do all the same things. There's a famous director whose name I can't remember, but he used to, when he'd get stuck on a creative problem, he'd jump in the car and drive home and have a shower and then drive back to work. And in that time, he would have the aha moment and get unstuck. So that's sort of like the release phase. And then the 3rd phase is the flow state. And then the 4th phase is the recovery, the active recovery. the goal is to not get stuck in any of those phases and to keep moving through them. And there's different techniques you can use, but they're really simple. They're really, really simple. Creating a time block. Okay, this is 2 hours. I'm going to get up in the morning and I'm going to struggle, or hopefully drop into a flow state. And depending on whether it's struggle or flow state, you might modify the way that you actively recover or release, essentially.
So I don't want to give away all of your secrets, but how does someone know when they need to go into active recovery and they're not in flow for too long? Because we know as ADHDers, if we're hyper focusing for too long, we burn out. We've released all of the chemicals. So how does one recognize that, okay, it's time to recover now? I've been in flow for too long.
That's such a great question. It's interesting because we sort of oscillate between hyper-focus and hypo-focus, right? Where we can't focus at all. And I think that really harsh sort of relationship, that contrast between those two states means that whenever we get into hyper-focus, it's so precious. And we want to squeeze every drop out of it because we don't know if we're going to get there again for another week. This might be the only day of the week where we're actually able to focus and get some really meaningful work done. And on a really micro level, I experienced this with Pomodoro timer, right? And a lot of my ADHD clients I can't do Pomodoro. It doesn't work for me. It's learning to trust that we will get back into that flow state again. It's learning to trust the flow cycle, essentially. So that's not a very concrete answer to just trust the flow cycle.
But I hear you. And I think I might have talked about this in a different episode, but the Flowmodoro method, you can either push through the Pomodoro because you're in flow, right? Or if you have a hard deadline where you have to leave and go pick up your kids, right? You cannot stop. Then you stop whatever it is that you're doing midway through. So if you're writing, you stop mid-sentence. So this way, when you come back to it, you haven't finished your thought. You go back to that mid-thought, which will help you get back into that creative flow again. Correct.
Actually, Stephen Kotler talks about writing his books and how leaving not finishing the full chapter of something and being that feeling of I've done it, and actually leaving it at a point where it's juicy and it's there's energy there. You're excited to write this next sentence. Leave it there because you're much more likely to get up the next day and be able to pick it up from there. Exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
I would say the other thing, just going back to the flow cycle on a micro level with Pomodoro, is that the reason I struggle with Pomodoro so much, and if people don't know what Pomodoro is, it's just time blocking 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, or 50 minutes on, 10 minutes off, and then repeating the process. I didn't treat the break properly. So let's say I have a 3-hour block of time where I'm doing deep work and I'm trying to get into a flow state. That 3 hours, I'm treating like an exam. My phone's off. I'm in a room. I've got and so when the timer goes off and says, time for a break now, in this really annoying American voice.
Hey, I know. We don't have the Aussie voice.
So in that 5-minute break, I do release or active recovery. I don't check my phone. I don't check my emails in that break. I sit. I get a glass of water. I go to the bathroom. I stand outside and look at the sun with my eyes closed. I do things that I'm still in my deep work session. I'm not it's not 25 minutes of focus, 5 minutes of distraction. It's 25 minutes of focus, 5 minutes of release. And then I'm going straight back into the flow state.
Yeah.
And I find that if I use that break properly, I can drop straight back in and pick up from where I left off.
That's amazing.
It's when I don't treat that break properly. Yeah.
It's amazing. And I think that, like you said, with ADHD, we try to just push through it. Oh, we don't know if we'll ever get back into the flow state. But we also have to recognize is that we have diminishing returns after our optimal focus time is done. So if you think of, you mentioned studying, right? Or reading a book, there is a time where we stop our focus, right? And we start drifting. Well, if we try to just, put on our boots and push through it, actually it's worse, right? We are sitting there with diminishing returns, and then all of a sudden our focus goes back to where it was. But what did we do for that whole time, right? We just wasted a bunch of time. So why not be active in our recovery and do something that's healthy to our brain, and give our brain oxygen and nourish our brain and do all of the things that is going to help us optimize our focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really cool thing that, Stephen Kotler and the guys at the Flow Research Collective are doing that's really positive is they're really emphasizing that they're linking active recovery to peak performance. A lot of stories about peak performance traditionally is about, pushing yourself with the carrot and stick until your fingers are bleeding and you're about to pass out.
Yeah.
And that's how we obtain peak performance. That's fine for the struggle phase, right? But you need to then switch off. It's good to put stress. It's good to put stress on the body. We go to the gym to put stress on our bodies, but then we don't just stay at the gym doing bicep curls 24/7 because our muscles will get smaller, not bigger.
Right.
And so it's that oscillation of stress on, off, between stress and recovery, essentially. Stress can actually be really positive.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Like you put the stress on the muscle and you start burning, and then your muscle gets bigger, right? But you have to take a break so it can actually recover to get bigger. Yeah. So talk to me now. You have the ADHD certification through 3C Activation. You have the Flowjo that you've created, right? And all of the flow training that you have learned. So how have you married the two and help your clients with ADHD?
Yeah, I feel like doing your training was the missing piece for me in terms of the connection between sort of like the neuroscience of flow, which I'm teaching in my course, along with the sort of Eastern philosophy of flow more holistically. And then really being able to explain to my clients with ADHD the neuroscience behind ADHD and a lot of the, explanations and interventions. I remember when I did your course, there was, a little bit of overlap between some of the interventions, but the framing within ADHD has just been so helpful for me personally and also my clients as well. So it's been really cool.
That's wonderful. So what would you say to an adult with ADHD? Because you're working with adults, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say the number one thing that you would want to leave them with here today if they, got one thing out of the multiple nuggets you've dropped along the way? One thing that you want them to remember with ADHD and flow?
Yeah, it would be find your Flowjo. Find a way to design your life around your superpower, which is what is uniquely you. Part of it's your ADHD brain, and part of it's just you as an individual. Really get clear on like who you are, what your values are, what your passions and your purpose are. Really check in with the body and see what lights you up and follow that energy. That's really what I feel like is our superpower, and what we're, if we can shed a lot of the negative self-talk around, how we're different and really embrace that, it no longer needs to be this neurodevelopmental disorder that we need to manage, rather our superpower that we can harness to live the best version of ourselves.
Yeah. Amen. So Jamie, if people want to master their flow using your Flowjo system and understand how to maximize their ADHD potential, where can they find you?
They can find me on my website, which is just myname.com, jamietoyne.com. And yeah, I have a sort of a diagnostic tool. It's very bare bones, but it's just in an Excel spreadsheet at the moment. But there's a bunch of questions on there. It's sort of like a quiz, and it's sort of diagnosed. It's like a diagnostic tool that runs you through a bunch of questions, and you can kind of get a feel for where you are on that scale of burnout and flow at this present moment. So it's kind of fun to check out. So that's free, and that's jamietoyne.com/FlowjoFinder.
Well, Jamie, thank you so much for being on the pod. It's been a pleasure working with you professionally and personally, and now getting to learn even more into your system. And I know you have such an open mindset and a growth mindset. And I know when we speak in a year from now and 2 years from now, you're going to be doing like 10 other amazing things with flow and ADHD and, business and public speaking, I'm sure. So I can't wait to keep up with you along your journey. I know you are a lifelong learner and that's part of your values as well. So thank you for your time today. It really is invaluable.
Oh, thank you so much. It's lovely to hang out with you again, Brooke. Yeah, hope to speak soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening to this episode of Successful with ADHD. I hope it helps you on your journey. And if you need any additional support for you or a loved one with ADHD, feel free to reach out to us at coachingwithbrooke.com and all social media platforms at Coaching with Brooke. And remember, it's Brooke with an E. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.